Okay, we're now live.
Okay, I'll make that 6:30 on the button. Welcome everybody to this meeting of Worthing Borough Council's Planning Committee, which for the first time in Worthing's history is going to be held virtually by way of video conference due to the extreme situation we all find ourselves in. I'd like to, before we start the meeting, I would like to take a few moments of reflection for two past borough councillors of Worthing that sadly passed away during the last week or so. That's ex-councillors Nora Fisher and Don Allen. I would like all members to just pause for a few moments of reflection for those two characters, and they were characters, lively characters, who will be sadly missed, not only by their friends and family, but by a lot of their ex-council colleagues. Thank you. Right, thank you for that. Heather, you're going to do a roll call for the members that are in attendance, please.
I'll start with Councillor Noel Atkins.
Present.
Councillor Paul Baker.
Present.
Councillor Jim Dean.
Present.
Councillor Karen Harman.
Present.
Councillor Paul High.
Present.
Councillor Helen Silman.
Present.
Councillor Steve Wills.
Present.
and Councillor Bob Smitherman.
Present.
Thank you.
Right, thank you for that. The council has advertised all of the planning applications to be considered this evening. Some people have applied to the council to speak either in support or to object to a planning application. Objectors and supporters will have 3 minutes maximum with each to speak. If you have registered to speak, I will announce you at the right time. You must keep your comments to planning matters and speak within your time limit. Following the representations, the committee will discuss the planning applications in turn and vote on each application to reach a decision. We will now go to Louise Matthey. You're going to read out the new sort of regulations or rules or guidelines for these remote meetings, please.
Thank you, Chairman. New regulations have recently been introduced to enable the Council to hold its meetings to include those participants attending remotely. To ensure the smooth running of such remote meetings, it has been necessary to amend some of the Council's procedure rules, and such rules have been amended by the Chief Executive in accordance with his urgency powers in the scheme of officer delegations. Consequently, the following procedures apply to this meeting. All right. Participation. During the meeting, all participants will be in control of their own microphone. You should set your microphone to mute until such time as the chairman invites you to speak. If you wish to speak, you should do so by activating the raise hand function in Zoom, which has previously been explained to you. Please be patient. The chairman will know you have indicated that you wish to speak and will get around to all members. The chairman has absolute discretion as to the order in which he invites participants to speak. When the chairman indicates that you can speak, you can unmute your microphone. When you have finished speaking, you will need to mute yourself again. Please also remember to lower your hand once you have spoken. Committee members are asked not to use the chat facility during the course of the meeting. The chat facility is only to be used by the chairman and the officers. If a committee member needs to declare an interest in a particular item once the meeting has started, they should do so in the usual way by making their declaration when they become aware of it. Voting. Voting will be conducted via a recorded vote. When the chairman indicates that a vote is to be taken, your name will be read out in alphabetical order by the Democratic Services Officer. You will need to unmute your microphone and say for, against, or abstain from the motion or amendment that has been put. Please remember to switch your microphone to mute again once you've indicated your vote. You are only able to participate in the vote if you have been present at the meeting for the duration of that agenda item, and that means being able to hear the meeting and be heard by the chairman. If you lose visual connection during an agenda item, you are not able to vote. Sorry, let me read that again. If you lose visual connection during an agenda item, you are able to vote. However, if you lose audio connection, however briefly, you should return a vote of abstain. Debates. The usual procedure rules for debate will apply to this meeting, and the chairman has absolute discretion. Adjournments. Should the chairman wish to adjourn the meeting at any time, he will advise the meeting that it is adjourned and what time it shall be reconvened. All participants should remain in the Zoom meeting with their microphone muted. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Louise. That was very clear and helpful. Thank you. We move on to the main agenda. Agenda item 1, substitute members. We have one substitute member, which is Councillor Bob Smitherman, who is substituting for Councillor McCabe. Can I take that as taken, Councillor Smitherman?
Agreed.
Thank you. We'll move on to, apart from that, the committee is as stated. Agenda item 2, declarations of interest. Have I got any declarations of interest from any members or officers on any of the items up for decision tonight, please? Councillor Noel Atkins.
Thank you, Chair. I wish to declare a personal interest in each of the items as a member of West Sussex County Council.
Thank you. In that case, I will echo that as an elected member of West Sussex County Council. Councillor Paul Baker.
Yes, Chair. The application for EDF car park, I am a Broadwater ward councillor, and this falls within my ward, although I've had no discussions over the subject and approach the meeting with a completely open mind.
Thank you. Councillor Paul Baker, Councillor Jim Dean.
Thank you. In relation to item 4 on the agenda, I have had a number of discussions with neighbours to this the site of this application. I have listened to the arguments they put. I am not predisposed how I will vote on this matter.
Thank you. I should also declare an interest in item 4 as it falls within my county council division. I've not had any communications with any residents, so therefore I'm not prejudiced in any way. Councillor Bob Smitherman.
Yes, likewise, for you, Chairman, and Councillor Atkins as a member of West Sussex County Council, personal interest.
Thank you. I've got no more raised hands. We move on to agenda item 3, which is confirmation of minutes. I'm asking the committee or those that were present to approve the minutes of the planning committee meetings, which were held on Wednesday, the 26th of February and Wednesday, the 4th of March, 2020, which have all been emailed to all members previously. Can I have a proposer that those minutes for both of those meetings are acceptable, and a seconder, please? Councillor Dean, you're proposing?
I am proposing acceptance of those minutes, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Dean. Councillor Atkins, you're seconding?
I am seconding the acceptance of those meeting minutes.
Thank you. I believe now we're going to ask Heather to go around the committee individually to take a vote on those minutes, please.
Will do. Councillor Noel Atkins.
Agreed.
Councillor Paul Baker.
Agreed.
Councillor Jim Dean.
Agreed.
Councillor Karen Harman.
Agreed.
Councillor Paul High.
Agreed.
Councillor Helen Silman.
Agreed.
Councillor Steve Wills.
Agreed.
Thank you.
Thank you. We move on to agenda item 4, items raised under urgency provisions. We have none, so we'll move straight on to the agenda item is going to be changed slightly. The order is going to be James Appleton is going to present 5-1 the Wheat Sheaf and 5-4 Rochney 19 Reigate Road, and Gary Peck is going to present 5-3 12 Hurston Close and 5-2 former EDF car park. So they will go in the order of 5-1, 5-4, 5-3, 5-2. Is that acceptable, committee? Thank you. Well, no one's saying it's not, so we'll move on. So we'll move straight on to 5-1. James Appleton, you're going to present this, please. This is the Wheat Sheaf, the old Wheat Sheaf Public House, Richmond Road, Worthing. James.
Yes, thank you, Chairman, and good evening, everyone. I propose to run through the planning application, details of elevations and photographs of the scheme. I then have some additional representations, and I also will be reading out representation from a neighbour who couldn't join us in person tonight. If I just start with the video presentation. So this is the first aerial photograph showing the Wheat Sheaf Public House, located between the Portland House building used by Ada and Worthing staff and the library. It's part of the civic quarter, and some of the representations have expressed concern about the principle of residential development on the site. But the previous applications, and there have been 2 on the site, have been refused primarily in relation to impact of development on properties to the south, Ambrose Place there in the photograph. And the last refusal was predominantly in relation to the size, height, density and site coverage of the proposed residential development, not the principle of redevelopment. But there have been some representations expressing concern about the environment for the new flats in particular. As you'll see from these photographs, there are public footpaths going either side of the former public house. Have some photographs. That's the boarded up public house. It has been on the market, it indicated in the report, since 2017. There have been various owners of this public house over the years, and it's been unoccupied for some time. And as I say, there have been 2 previous proposals to try and secure residential redevelopment of the site. Again, showing the footpaths that run very close to the building. This is the rear of the public house. There's a small enclosed public house garden to the rear, and then further to the north is this very large oak tree, which has a preservation order on the tree. This is looking to the south. This is from the gardens of Ambrose Place. This is looking towards the Wheatsheaf Public House, just seeing the top roof and then the higher structures of the library and Portland House just to the west of the application site. This is from a first floor window looking across to the site. And then another view looking across to the application site. And again, from this raised view, you can see the footpath to the west. We saw earlier the footpath to the east of the existing public house. So I think this elevation has been repeated in the committee report, just to sort of highlight the key difference between the refuse scheme earlier this year. And as you can see from this comparison, the main change is the removal of the top floor. That results in a reduction in height of 2.7 meters, a corresponding reduction in floor space and density. The previous scheme refused was for 8 flats, 8 larger flats with a 3-bedroom flat. This reduced scheme is for 7 flats, 2 studio flats, 3 1-bedroom and 2 2-bedroom flats. The site coverage remains as before. That's the proposed east elevation and the refused elevation below. West elevation and the north elevation. That's a detail of some of the proposed materials, features. The applicant's design and access statement makes reference to the sort of yellow buff bricks used for the redevelopment of the Montague Centre as a local reference of a buff yellow brick. And these are some images, again, sketch proposals indicating what was refused with that upper floor. Had a large south-facing balcony. Clearly, the removal of that reduces some of the overlooking to properties to the south, although that didn't constitute one of the refusal reasons. And again, this is a view looking south towards the rear elevation and the rear of Portland House and the large preserved tree. You'll see that the applicant has indicated a green roof for the flat roof area. And in discussions with the applicants, they're happy to have a condition in relation to potential opportunities for solar panels and to explore other sustainable methods of energy production. That's particularly relevant because the council is looking at the potential for a district heat network in connection with the redevelopment for the health hub proposal, which is to the northwest in the car park that serves the town hall complex. This is just the layout plans. There is a communal rear garden area, and I'll move to that plan just to show that there is the opportunity for bike storage, which has been raised by some of those raising objections to development, but the intention is to provide space for 8 cycles as required by the County Council, and that can be conditioned to ensure that's delivered. There is a communal garden area, To the rear, there's 2 private areas, 2 ground floor flats to the north there, and then on the south elevation, an amenity space enclosed by wall and railing on that south elevation. So there is some amenity space, albeit limited, because it obviously is a fairly extensive site coverage. But this scheme has been reduced since the refusal in 2018 to ensure there's no adverse impact on the tree root system for the large preserved tree, and our council's arboriculturist is happy with that. You can just see on this plan the blue edging, which is the outline of the existing public house. So there is a slight increase in floor space, but not significantly, as the report indicates, about 11% increase in floor area over the existing public house. This just shows the root protection zone for the preserved tree, and that the building would remain outside of that root protection zone. That's just a coloured layout plan, which is quite effective. It shows a bit more clearly the outline of the existing public house to be demolished, and the footprint of the proposed flats, and the small enclosed communal garden area at the rear. That's the 2018 scheme, and you can see a much larger development which stepped forward at the front here, incorporated a commercial unit, but was a much higher, larger and bulkier development. This is the current proposal before you now, with the top floor removed. There has been quite a bit of comment about the loss of the public house and whether the site would be more suited to civic use. This is clearly a site outside the control of the council, and there have been 2 previous proposals for residential. As I say, there's no objection in principle to residential, and I think the applicant's agent was keen to stress that given the council cannot currently demonstrate a 5-year supply of housing, and does not have a up-to-date development plan, there is a risk that any subsequent appeal, if this was refused, there would be a strong case to say that the council does need additional residential development. And as the National Planning Policy Framework indicates, where there is a shortfall of housing, and particularly where there's not an adopted development plan, there should be a presumption in favour of sustainable development, particularly residential development where there is such a need for new housing to meet our future housing needs. So that's in effect the presentation, Chairman. I have got a number of representations which I will just run through now. We have got a number of representations set out in the report, but since the report was written, we now have 2 further letters of objection, raising similar concerns to those set out in the report, but I'll just briefly run through those. Largely, the comments express concern that the previous reasons for objection still stand, have not been overcome. Proposal amounts to an overdevelopment, offering poor, cramped accommodation and a poor quality living environment. The proposal does not meet local plan standards for external amenity space, and is not mitigated by the accessibility to nearby public open space. In addition, the on-site external amenity space will be subject to overshadowing from the large oak tree and tall adjacent buildings, be harm to residential amenity due to loss of privacy from upper floor windows, balconies overlooking rear gardens of Ambrose Place, inappropriate design that would not harmonise with the surrounding built form, which would harm the character and appearance of the area, insufficient secure cycle storage, insufficient waste storage provision, no recognition of the climate emergency within the design of the scheme, excessive scale, harm the setting of the conservation area and the setting of nearby listed and civic buildings. And rather than residential, the site should be used for alternative uses that would provide more community benefit. We've had a couple of additional consultation responses, one from the county archaeologists recommending a condition to secure historic building recording and archaeological scheme of investigation. That is covered in the conditions recommended. In relation to sustainability issues, the applicant has clarified that the design has very much taken a fabric first approach to maximise the energy efficiency of the proposed building materials, but they do recognise that there will be opportunities for sustainable energy production, and I've mentioned about the potential of a district heat network, and therefore in addition to the conditions set out in the agenda, I would like to recommend an additional condition around the sustainable measures to be submitted in relation to any energy use and production, and that be an additional planning condition. We also have a letter of representation from Mr. Martin Mewton, who lives at 20C Christchurch Road, and he would like the following to be taken into account by the planning committee. The question we need to look at now, because the committee rejected unanimously the previous plans, that's a scheme submitted in 2019, is does the reduction from 4 to 3 floors make a difference to the overall development issue? I still consider 3 floors to be an overdevelopment in as much as 7 flats are now crammed into 3 floors, representing an increase in flat to floor ratio of 16.5% compared to the 2019 plan. In this respect, you could say the density of overdevelopment has got worse, although clearly the height of the overall building is now lower than 2019 scheme. In terms of the overall building and the available space, there is still a problem of the new design being over-dominant. By way of an analogy, there is far greater space between Portland House and the Law Courts, where such a block of flats would not be so dominant. Also, the privacy problem of ground floor windows and external paths, the lack of parking, as well as conservation harmony issues are still problem areas. The high proportion of development in a limited space still constitutes overdevelopment, and the plan should be rejected. Bearing in mind the large nearby proposed developments at Union Place and at Tevilgate, the need for another block of flats in the town centre area is not so paramount. In addition, we need to maintain the integrity of our central civic administration area. By this, I mean the square area bounded by Richmond, Christchurch, Stoke Abbott and Chapel Roads. Hence an alternative proposal for the Wheatsheaf, which dates from circa 1835 to 40, the end of a row of cottages. And can I say, I do not know how the builders, insurers assess the fire damage of June 2018. Could be, for example, a full restoration of the building with a view to use by the museum's heritage service, utilising the garden area. Or secondly, a partly restored, partly converted building could serve in an ancillary capacity to the new proposed medical hub. Or thirdly, promoting and rejuvenating the site's commercial use, a cafe or IT junction, art studios, or a dedicated tourist information facility. And that's the end of the representation from Mr. Mewton. Thank you, Chairman. I'm happy to take any questions on the presentation.
Right, thank you, James. Committee, James has sort of skipped one bit there. At this stage, have you got any questions on the presentation? We're not up for discussion on the application at this stage. Have you got any questions or any clarification on what James has presented to us? Councillor Jim Dean, please.
Thank you, Chair. 2 or 3 questions, I think, but I'll take them one by one. It's referred to in the report that the decision taken on in 2019 is being appealed. That presumably is going through at the moment. Have we any idea of the sort of timetable on appeals? Are they being held up by the inspectorate at the moment because of the current situation, or is it likely that this result will come from this fairly soon? It does seem a little odd to be considering another application when an appeal is still outstanding.
James?
Yes, Councillor Dean, a couple of things then in response to that. We have got the appeal. We're not aware of any particular delays with the planning inspectorate, although given that we're halfway through a fairly lengthy lockdown period, we're not precisely sure whether it will affect the performance of the planning inspectorate. They are still dealing with appeals, and it's difficult to give any real timeline for that. It's not unusual for an applicant to effectively twin track, put a revised scheme in, still pursue an appeal. So that's not a necessarily unusual practice. I think if planning permission is granted here, I suspect the applicants would still pursue their appeal to try and secure the additional floor, but perhaps the agent, when he speaks, might want to comment on that aspect.
Councillor Dean, you had a couple of more points?
Yeah, if possible. On the archaeological report, as it's presented in a fairly sort of light way. It refers to no objection, but actually the original report said no objection subject to a whole range of suitable mitigation measures. I kind of have a concern about these kind of conditions in that they are actually quite detailed in this case. This is in an area which is identified as a red alert, very sensitive area in the historic environment record archaeological notification area, which means that those kind of issues have to be taken very seriously. And I do wonder whether we have the capacity to actually follow through the kind of detailed condition that the archaeological recommendation is in the archaeologist's report, whether we have the capacity to undertake the kind of work that is required by that. And also, just whilst we're at it, can you just confirm that that detailed recommendation would be included as the condition, rather than the rather truncated version as presented in the report?
James?
Yes, you have a précis of the full archaeological condition, which is our standard condition, but would go into the necessary detail. I should just reassure you, members, that we don't have the expertise within the council, but in terms of discharging that condition, we would either use the county archaeologist, but more likely we may have to get independent archaeological advice to make sure that that condition is fully discharged. It is very much the nature of the condition. It puts the onus on the applicant to do the appropriate recording of the building prior to demolition, and then very much a watching brief of the investigation of the site. And clearly, if there's anything found, then that would need further investigation by an independently appointed archaeologist. We have still got an arrangement for the county archaeologist to do some of our work, but largely the county council has withdrawn its specialist services, so we do need to appoint when required.
James, your volume seems to have gone down somewhat. I was struggling to hear a lot of that, but can you make sure your volume's turned up?
Yes, I've done that now. Hopefully that's a bit clearer.
Yeah, it was louder when you started. It's gone a bit dim. Right, Councillor Dean, is that satisfied, or have you got more points?
Yeah, just as a rider to that, yes, I was aware of the issue with county councils withdrawal of services, and that really was the point of raising the matter. I think it is one that really does have to be watched, because this is a very sensitive area, and it is one of the oldest buildings and possibly has the most undisturbed area of ground in whole of the centre of Worthing. And it is very easy for somebody during demolition just to demolish and then say, oh, sorry about that. opportunity lost. So it is one. I'm hoping that being right next door to the offices, it will be possible to make sure that enforcement, if we come to that, it does actually happen. Just one final thing on the question of the actual change in the applications. Am I right to say that externally, the only thing that has changed is the loss of the top floor? In other words, nothing else has changed, and that in effect, that any other changes are just internal redivision of the internal part of the building.
James?
Yes, that's correct. So it is effectively just the internal layout changes and the removal of the top floor.
Okay, thank you. Any other members of the committee? Have you got any points of clarification or on James's report to us? No? Right, we'll move on. Can I invite Susan Belton from the Worthing Society? Wants to make a representation. Susan, can you speak to us, please? You have 3 minutes. And good evening, Susan. Nice to see you in different sort of circumstances.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can indeed, Susan.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, good evening, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. Susan Milton, Worthing Society Chair. The Worthing Society has considered the unanimous refusal by the Planning Committee of the earlier 2019 application. The grounds for refusal were that the plans would represent overdevelopment of a compact site and would have an adverse effect on the nearby heritage assets. Whilst there is some improvement following the reduction in height, which will go some way to addressing the overlooking of properties in Ambrose Place, we still consider the revised design represents overdevelopment. This remains a very compact, narrow site, and there are 7 units proposed over 3 floors, as opposed to 8 units over 4 in the previous application, which in our view accentuates the problem of overdevelopment. The 2 ground floor studio flats are relatively small as well. The proposal may not give the best standard of accommodation to future residents. The balconies will look out over Richmond Road and be exposed to traffic fumes. We note that the external space for occupiers would be below the council's own SPD and space standards for external space, which indicates strongly compromises have had to be made. In fact, the nearest green space is Victoria Park, which is some way off. Future development of the healthcare centre is likely to add pedestrian footfall. Either side of the traffic through the new centre could be substantial, and it will pass the northwest corner of the proposal site, increasing the likelihood of noise disturbance and a sense of enclosure. Regarding the effect on the proximate heritage assets, the new building will not enhance the conservation area, civic area, or nearby listed buildings. The east-facing elevation still appears, in our view, over-dominant. A residential block within the civic centre remains incongruous. Even though there's been reduction in height and mass, the overall design of the new building still appears cramped and does not sit well within this location. We also consider the heritage value of the wheat sheaf as perhaps being given insufficient weight by the applicant's team. The consideration should be given to a redevelopment of the existing building, perhaps for community uses. If this proves to be technically impossible, a less intrusive, lower design would be desirable. In terms of relevant planning policies, we submit the current proposal is still not commensurate with the National Planning Policy Framework, the Council's SPD on external space, and Core Strategy Policy 16. We consider, therefore, that the application has not sufficiently addressed the reasons identified for the previous refusal. The new design would still be harmful to the appearance of the civic location and setting of the heritage assets, and should also be refused. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Susan.
Pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
No problem at all. Members, have you got any questions for Susan on what she said, please? No, right, we move on. We've now got Alex Bateman of Motion Cooper Limited, who's going to speak up in support of the application. Alex, you've got 3 minutes when you commence talking to us. Good evening.
Just checking you can hear me.
Yes, we can indeed.
Perfect. I'd like to start by thanking the officers for their time with the application. Obviously, as already discussed, this does represent a resubmission of a previously refused scheme earlier this year. As a result, it's important to recognise what has already been established and what has been amended to overcome the previously refused scheme. There remains no objection from highways, environmental health on either noise or disturbance, your tree officer, your drainage officer, your county archaeologist, or your design and conservation officer. It's also important to recognise, as set out in the planning statement and your officer's report, that the tilted balance is in play, with Worthing Borough Council in need of housing in sustainable locations. The recently published housing delivery test figures highlight this need further. In Worthing, the need for housing is reaching critical levels, with brownfield sites in sustainable locations playing a key role in delivering required housing. Planning policy at all levels requires that we focus development on such sites. The site falls within a central location in Worthing, with easy access to the train station, bus stops, and all facilities required for day-to-day functions. The site is therefore within a very sustainable location. Some respondents have referenced a preference to retain the existing building, which closed in July 2017. Not only is this physically impossible due to the existing constraints and condition of the building, but the refusal earlier this year confirms that there was no objection to the replacement of the building. Some respondents have suggested that the public house should reopen. However, the refusal earlier this year confirmed that there was no objection to the loss of the public house. Some respondents have suggested that proposals will result in overlooking of properties on Ambrose Place. Again, the refusal earlier this year confirmed that there was no objection based on overlooking. In terms of comparing the proposals with the previously refused scheme, it's obvious what changes have been made to address the single reason for refusal of overdevelopment. The new proposals have reduced the height of the building from 4 stories to 3, with the loss of the 3-bedroom unit. In doing so, the height of the building has been reduced by from 11.3 to 9.3 metres, a 22% reduction. In addition, there is a reduction in floor space by nearly 100 square metres, or 17%. When comparing the existing building with that of the proposals, there is only a small increase in footprint of 11%. Taking all of these figures, it is clear that the revisions have reduced the height, scale, and bulk to address the only concern of overdevelopment. The scheme now delivers 7 residential apartments on a brownfield site in Worthing Town Centre, a very sustainable location. We therefore welcome the officer's recommendation and urge the committee to grant planning permission. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Alex. Members, have you got any questions for Alex on what he presented to us, please? Councillor Jim Dean.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to ask, and thank you very much for your presentation, Mayor. Thanks for coming and joining us in this unusual format. I think it's probably a first for you, is it? A first for us. But I would just like to ask you whether you're happy with the design as you've ended up. I mean, it seems to me that you had a building, you sliced the top floor off, probably the only thing that created a little bit of visual interest in what has now become a pretty well a square box. Just wondered whether you were happy with that as architect, and would, if you preferred the previous design, are you happy with one that's just got the top sliced off it?
I suppose it's worth, I don't want to waffle on too much, to apologise. There was quite a history to the design in that the previous scheme, so apologies to give a bit of history, but we engaged via a pre-application meeting on the original scheme. We actually had 2 schemes that we went through at pre-app, and the scheme was amended through design with conversations with the previous planning officer and the design and conservation officer. So the previous scheme was something that had been an agreement between ourselves and the local authority in terms of a design response. Moving forward, essentially from our perspective, we were very keen to retain those elements which referenced key buildings within Worthing, in particular the Montague Centre, and how, I mean, I have to admit, I came up with the idea of the sort of, I'm going to use the phrase fake windows. I'm actually not an architect, I'm a planner, so I will use the phrase fake windows, but essentially the brick detailing was something that I was very keen to retain. Now, what we've ended up with is a building that I feel is still of a high quality. I think in terms of the top floor, and what we've lost is a sort of contemporary approach with sort of zinc finish to the top floor. Actually, as a planner, say not as an architect, I liked the top floor. I felt that it was something that we do see quite often. However, we are responding to that previous concern of overdevelopment and acknowledging that actually that's an element which we could lose whilst retaining the overwhelming design approach of the building.
Thank you for your response.
All right, thank you, Mr. Bateman. Have any other members got any questions for Mr. Bateman? No, right, then members, we will go into general discussion about these, please. If you want to say something, please raise your hand and I will take people in order. What your views are on this, and whether you think we should allow it or not. Who's going to start? Councillor Noel Atkins, please.
Thank you, Chair. I must admit I preferred the 2018 design because it had commercial space on the ground floor, you know, which is something that we appreciate, and I just wonder why that has been removed.
Okay, well, this isn't the time to ask questions, but it has been removed. And I'll take your point. Councillor Steve Wills.
Thank you, Chair. I had a problem with the previous two applications. The first one I just didn't like at all, even with the commercial unit on the ground floor. And the one earlier where it was too tall. So removing that fourth floor, as far as I can see in my mind, this new building now, this new development will fit nicely between Portland House and the library. And so too with the materials that are going to be used. And in the summer, Ambrose Place will be shielded by any trees and foliage. And in the winter, most people, because it will be dark, will be indoors with their blinds or curtains drawn. So I don't really see there's any problem whatsoever there. When it comes to the traffic situation, the traffic in the area is continuously on the move. Most people in the flats, apartments will be at work or college, school during the day, and only home of a night time. So I rest my case for there. So I would approve this development. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Councillor Wills. Councillor Helen Selman, please.
Thank you, Chair. I think the building now looks extremely weird. It's lost its proportions, just slicing off the top floor, but without making any other interesting features in the building, I think has made it very unappealing. Although in fact, I think it's not desirable to put residential units in this particular spot. It's not because I'm against having residential units in the town centre in a sustainable location, but this just isn't the right location. I think whatever is done here, you cannot squeeze aesthetically or in connection with the conservation area and the big civic buildings, a unit of small residential properties here. It doesn't work for me at all. Shouldn't be done.
Thank you. Councillor Paul Baker, please.
Thank you, Chair. I don't think it's a particularly attractive looking building now, but then I don't think it was probably particularly attractive without the top floor being sliced off. We did reject it on overdevelopment, and obviously we've lost a story, we lost the fourth story, so maybe that overdevelopment isn't severe enough to actually reject it now. Whether it's in the right place or not is open for debate, but I'm wondering what else would go there if it wasn't a building for residential use. I don't think that there's anything coming forward that would suggest that it could be used for any other application. So, as I say, it's not that attractive, but I've never thought the library or Portland House are that attractive, to be honest with you. So I think we're probably going to have to I'm probably going to have to fall in line with Steve Wills, Councillor Steve Wills, and say I think I will support it on this occasion.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Paul Baker. If I can come in now, I've got to say that I agree with Councillor Silman. To me, and I said this at the last meeting when we rejected the taller building, to me it's in the wrong place. It's in a civic quarter hub. To put accommodation there, I know we need accommodation, but there's a lot of accommodation coming on in the town centre in different developments which are going through at the moment. There's no parking for these individuals that are going to live there. There's no parking at all for them. Presumably people who are going to live there not going to have cars, because if they do have cars, they won't have anywhere to park them. They'll have to walk 2 or 3 miles each evening and each morning to get to their cars, to get out of the controlled parking zones. To me, it seems ridiculous to put accommodation in that area, but that's my personal opinion. Councillor Jim Dean.
Thank you very much. I'm kind of following on from what you said, but I think also it's been kind of presented as if all the answers have been that we identified in the previous application are being answered by this one. And I mean, I think to an extent we've kind of gone backwards a bit as well, and I think that we shouldn't ignore that. I mean, yes, we identified in that the proposal, due to its size, mass density, and site coverage, represented overdevelopment. Well, we've perhaps addressed some of the issues, size, and to an extent, I suppose, also then the mass. But density, in my view, has gone up. We actually identified in the first, the 2018 one, that density in terms of cramming more into that space to the detriment of the residents of those apartments was an issue, and one that we felt strongly about, and we're now squeezing more into a smaller space. And of course, the site coverage is still exactly the same. But we did also comment in those reasons for refusal last time that it would appear cramped and harmful to the appearance in this prominent location and the character of the area, which immediately joins Chapel Road, the Chapel Road Conservation Area, with its setting of listed buildings. So our objections were rather wider than just whether it was a bit tall and a bit broad and a bit of a massy kind of building. It was very much in that position, that setting, in that place, and so for me, we haven't crossed over any imaginary line that renders this building more acceptable in that in that position. It's still the same, and to an extent, I think we've now ended up with something which is, if you like, less elegant because it's just a square block facing onto road. And yeah, for that reason, I will be objecting to this application as I did on the last occasion.
Thank you, Councillor Dean. Councillor Robert Smitherman.
Thank you, Chairman. fascinating debate. It's really interesting. Obviously, I haven't sat on the planning committee for a while, so I haven't been on the previous applications. But I'm hearing the presentations from both sides. It's really quite interesting. How hearing some members think it's not quite as good as the one previously. And actually, I quite like the first one really. But I think I think the applicant should be praised that they have listened to the concerns around overdevelopment. And I very much support this. Really, I think it's a really good scheme. I think they've clearly listened to the objections. I think it fits in very nicely, and I'm very, very happy to support it, Chairman.
Thank you. Contrary to what your colleague said last time, James Appleton, you want to come back in?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I think that Councillor Dean actually picked up on the comments I would have made, and I think it's just making sure that we concentrate on the revised scheme and whether it's addressed the previous refusal reason. So, Chairman, I hear your concerns around wrong location and parking, but we didn't refuse the principle of residential here or parking issues. There was no parking with the previous commercial use. So I think the key thing is whether this has addressed the previous refusal reason. The only comment on density is that this is a 12.5% reduction in density. Yes, we've gone from 8 to 7 flats, but obviously they're significantly smaller flats, 2 studios and 1 bedrooms. We've lost the larger 3-bedroom unit. And so whilst the numbers has only gone down by 1, it has been a reduction in density. Now, whether that's sufficient and whether that addresses the issue about the crampedness of the development and site coverage, that's for members to decide. But I think really you need to really assess it in relation to the refusal set out on page 4 of the agenda. Thanks.
Thank you, James. I fail to see how you can compare parking for patrons using a public house to parking for people living in an accommodation. It's 2 entirely different things. So to try and compare the 2 is doesn't make sense to me. But that's my opinion. Councillor Helen Selman.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to check with Mr. Appleton. Of course, if we refuse this, but the appeal is successful, the applicant will be able to build the 4-storey building.
Correct.
Thank you.
James, did you want to comment on that?
No, just that is the case, Councillor Silman. So obviously, if appeals allowed, it either way, it could mean that the appeal proposal is built out on this site.
And also, members, on that same point that Councillor Silman made, if this is approved tonight and the appeal goes through and the appeal is won, then the previous one could still be built anyway. Am I correct for that, James? They'll have two sets of plans approved.
Yes, that's right, and they can choose which one to implement.
Okay, any other members want to make any comments? Well, I need someone to propose something, please. Councillor Jim Dean, you got a proposition for us?
I have, Chair. I would like to propose that we don't accept the recommendation of the officers in this case and that we refuse this application pretty well much on the same grounds as last time. I think the wording is almost, it still fits the reasons for that objection being made.
Thank you. Do I have a seconder for that? If I go down the hands in order, someone might be seconding it, or they might be making another proposal. So Heather, if you can help me here and keep track of it. Councillor Steve Wills, you're next up. Could you unmute yourself, Councillor Wills, please?
I propose that we accept the recommendation.
Thank you. Councillor Robert Smitherman, you're next.
I'd like to second that, Chairman.
What? Which one?
Apologies, Councillor Wills.
Councillor Wills, thank you. Councillor Noel Atkins, you're next up.
I was going to second the refusal.
What, Councillor Deans?
Yeah.
You want to second Councillor Dean's proposal to refuse, yeah?
I do, yes.
Okay, thank you. And Councillor Silman has withdrawn, so I presume she was going to second that. So we've got two proposals duly seconded. Chris or Heather, which one do you advise me to take first? Or Louise? Louise.
Thank you, Chairman. The first proposal that was properly seconded was the proposal to permit...
Councillor Deans. Councillor Deans.
No, Councillor Smitherman's.
Oh, the first one that was seconded?
Correct.
Okay, so we've got a proposition from... It was from Councillor Wills. I believe
Yes.
it was Councillor Wills proposed that we accept this, to approve it, and Councillor Smitherman seconded it. Right. So to be clear, members, what we're voting on, I will ask Heather to go through the voting procedure in a second, but to be clear, you're voting on the recommendation to approve the plans with those added conditions that James Appleton put on before, the archaeological one and the other one was, remind me, James, what was the other condition?
In relation to sustainability measures.
Right, so there was two extra conditions to be put on. So you're voting to approve it, and it was proposed by Councillor Wills, seconded by Councillor Smitherman. Heather, can you take the vote, please?
Councillor Noel Atkins, for, against or abstain.
Against.
Councillor Paul Baker, for, against or abstain.
For.
Councillor Jim Dean, for, against, abstain.
Against.
Councillor Karen Harman, for, against, abstain.
Against.
Sorry?
Against.
Against. Councillor Paul High, for, against, abstain.
Against.
Councillor Helen Silman, for, against, abstain.
Against.
Councillor Bob Smitherman, for, against, abstain.
For.
Councillor Steve Wills, for, against or abstain.
For.
So that's 3 for and 5 against.
So that has failed. So we now go to the second proposition, which was put forward by Councillor Jim Dean, and it was seconded by Councillor Noel Atkins, if I'm correct. Was that correct, Louise? Right. So we've got the proposition, just to be clear to members, proposed by Councillor Jim Dean, seconded by Councillor Noel Atkins, to refuse this application on the grounds that Jim will tell us should it be successful. So Heather, can you go to the vote, please?
Councillor Noel Atkins, for, against or abstain. This is the refusal. Sorry?
For.
For the refusal.
For the refusal.
Councillor Paul Baker.
Against.
For, against. Against. Councillor Jim Dean. For, against, abstain.
For.
For. Councillor Karen Harman. For, against, abstain.
For.
Councillor Paul High. For, against,
For.
abstain. For.
For.
Councillor Helen Silman. For, against, abstain.
For.
Councillor Bob Smitherman. For, against, abstain.
Against.
And Councillor Steve Wills. For, against, abstain.
Against.
1, 2, 3. That's 5 for refusal, 3 against. Thank you.
Thank you. So this application has been rejected by the committee on a 5-3 basis. Councillor Jim Dean, can you provide some reasons, please,
As
for the officers?
I stated in making this proposition, I think the reasons for refusal are substantially the same as those made for refusing the previous 2019 application. Do you want me to read those out as they were presented before to make sure?
Yes, yes, please, Councillor Dean. I think that would be helpful.
Okay. The reasons for refusal were the proposal, due to its size, mass, density, and site coverage, is considered to represent an overdevelopment of the site, which would appear cramped and will be harmful to the appearance of this prominent location and character of the area, which immediately adjoins the Chapel Road conservation area and setting of listed buildings. It is therefore contrary to the policy 16 of the Worthing Borough Core Strategy 2011 and paragraphs 190 and 192 of the NPPF 2019. I'd take advice from James as to whether any of those he feels cannot be sustainable in making this objection.
Thank you, Councillor Dean. Mr. Appleton, does that suffice?
Yes, that reflects the comments of the committee. I suppose the only thing I would just like committee to comment on was any reference to design as part of that refusal, just to clarify, because there were some comments about the revised design.
Well, I think the general discussion was that the whole thing is in the wrong place. I think putting it anywhere else in the town, it would probably be acceptable, but not in that location. So, I mean, you can add design into it as well. I don't think the committee will argue with that. Louise, Matthew, you want to come in?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. So the proposal was for refusal on that sole ground, the overdevelopment. So I would suggest that the committee has refused it on that sole ground and shouldn't now add additional reasons.
Point taken, thank you. Councillor Jim Dean, you want to come back or not? No, you took your hand down.
Oh, yeah, I took my hand down, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Right, well, that one's dealt with. So we now move on to the fourth application, which is AWDM/1827/19 Roshney, 19 Reigate Road, Worthing. James, you're presenting this one to us as well, I believe.
Sorry, Chairman, just to interrupt briefly. I believe Councillor Dean declared an interest at the start of this one. Is that correct, Councillor Dean?
I did declare an interest in that. I had correspondence on and contact with some neighbours, but I had listened to their comments, listened to what they had said without comment, and I wasn't predisposed or to take any particular view on this until this evening meeting.
That's fine. Thank you for the clarification.
Thank you. James, can you present this one to us, please?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Let me just share my screen and
I have, before you carry on, James, yep. I've got Chris, I've got Susan Belton is asking to be admitted, please. Chris, can you hear me?
She's been admitted, Chair.
Oh, thank you very much. Carry on, James.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. So the aerial photograph you have before you shows you the application site. Let me just highlight the property. It is a large detached property. I say large because, as you can see, it has been extended over the years. Its former use was as a care home, and as many care homes keep up with changing regulations, have had various extensions over the years. So the application is for the change of use of that former care home to 6 flats, a 1-bedroom flat and 5 2-bedroom flats. There's a bungalow with accommodation in the roof, a chalet bungalow to one side and a 2-storey house to the other. This is on the sort of northwest side of Reigate Road. This is another photograph showing the site here with the flat roof extensions visible to the rear, and the adjoining 2 properties I mentioned. As before, I'll run through the proposal and then I have 3 representations to read out from interested parties that were keen to let the committee aware of their objections to the proposal. So this is the location plan, and this is useful just to show that the only extension as such is an extension to the rear of an existing garage, which is to be converted to form additional accommodation for the proposed flats. That's the existing layout as a care home with, you can see the flat roof rear extensions. And this is the proposal to convert the building into 6 flats. You can see the proposal in terms of the different colours denote the different flats, with a 1-bedroom flat to be created within the roof space. The roof space used to be occupied as a flat anyway, and therefore there are existing roof lights for that flat, and there is a proposal to provide a rear patio doors to that for a flat contained within the roof. That there is the slight extension to the single-storey garage, which is to provide a bathroom for that unit 3 there. It's not considered that that extension in itself would have any adverse impact on the adjoining property to the right there. In terms of amenity space, the plan there shows that there is amenity space proposed for the various flats. There is a raised terrace area here for the 1st floor flat on part of the flat roof. And there is a privacy screen along that terrace, which we'll see in a moment, which prevents overlooking to the adjoining property. The application does propose creating some amenity space at the front, and an additional wall is proposed to block off what was the access to the single-storey garage. There's no objection in principle to this, but you'll see from the report there has been concerns about the impact in the area in terms of additional car parking on the roads or demand for on-street car parking. I'll show you some photographs in a moment. Just to the elevations, that's the extension to the rear of the single-storey garage. That's the privacy screen to the flat roof amenity area created on part of the flat for a part of the flat roof for the 1st floor flat. There's the double doors on the front creating access into or light into the converted garage area. But the existing properties, you can see from the elevations, quite an attractive property. It has been unoccupied for a while and does need some refurbishment. That's on the flat created within the roof space. You can see the rear doors, patio doors, and the Juliet balcony to provide some amenity for the top floor flat. There's the terrace on the flat roof, and then further Juliet doors on the rear of the building. There has been some concerns about overlooking windows. There are 2 existing windows facing the bungalow to the north of the site, and so there is an additional window on that elevation, but you'll see in the conditions that it is proposed to obscure or part obscure windows at 1st floor level on the side elevations of the proposal to avoid overlooking to adjoining properties. You can just see on that plan also the proposal for bike storage for the proposed flats. So just to the photographs, that photograph there shows that wall will be extended to close off that access. That in turn will provide some increase to on-street parking, albeit it's only the width of the existing driveway there. The majority of the flats are accessed from the front and one to the side. That's the two windows I mentioned that currently do overlook the adjoining property in the care home, which the condition seeks to part obscure glaze. That's the property to the side. It's number 17 Reigate Road. Again, an unusual property with a sort of an angled bay on the corner, and there's two windows overlooking already, but there is a proposal to part obscure glaze to reduce overlooking to the property, that property number 17. That's the existing access, which will be used to gain access to the flats. That's the existing driveway. Another view of the two windows overlooking the chalet bungalow number 21. This is another view of the elevation, the gable facing number 17. The gap between number 19 and the neighbouring property number 17. You see number 17 also has a window. So there is some intervisibility already. Again, showing those two windows and a street view of the relationship with number 21. And another view from the side of number 21 looking up to the existing windows. And again, this is a view from the rear in Ripley Road looking to the flat roof rear extension. Again, that's to be altered to provide sort of Juliet balconies for the flats in the rear conversion or the rear flat roof two-storey element. So I'll probably just go back to a last look at the layout plan. And that's just the elevations just to show some of those things that I mentioned. That's the sort of the roof terrace for the flat with the privacy screen, and then that's the small extension to the side. The neighbouring property does have a garage this side as well, as you saw in the photograph, so it's not considered the extension has any impact, and there is a proposal to reduce the overlooking to adjoining properties. It's worth mentioning that you can see that these are largely a bathroom on the side there, another bathroom there, but a bedroom there, and part obscure glazing will help just reduce sort of overlooking to the adjoining properties. So that's the presentation. I'll go back to that view, and then Chairman, if I could read the three representations.
Can we pause there, because on my procedure, James, we now get to the stage where members can ask you questions on your presentation, and then you read them out. Okay. Just yes, I'm not being pedantic, but I'm going down. I'm following the order that I've been given. Right. So members, if you've got any questions for James on the presentation that he's put in front of you, we're not open discussion about the application at this moment. It's just for clarification. Councillor Jim Dean.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to ask you, James, there was a previous application which I think was quite widely publicised, and certainly was one that was brought to my attention, which I think involved a larger number of apartments. I think mostly single bedroom or studio flats, maybe, and it was withdrawn. It seems to me that the changes have addressed probably what were the issues, but is that the case? Were the issues dealt with the applicant by your team, and is this the solutions that were provided to an unsatisfactory earlier application?
James?
Yes, Councillor Dean, you're correct. There was an earlier application that was withdrawn following advice from your officers that it wouldn't be supported. We have worked with the applicants to address some of those concerns. The density, the number of flats has been reduced, and the previous proposal also included a number of extensions. So this is the revised proposal to address officers' concerns. Nevertheless, there have still been some concerns from adjoining residents to this revised proposal.
Thank you very much, James.
Thank you. Any other members have got any questions for James on the presentation? No, can you lower your hand, please, Councillor Dean? Thank you. Right, James, I believe you've got some written representations from Liam Connor, Shelley Johnston and Dawn Gibbs, who are all objecting and they are unable to attend it virtually. So you're going to read out their objections, please.
Yes, that's correct, Chairman. So the first representation from Liam Connor. We understand that the housing shortage needs to be addressed both locally and nationally, but feel that the proposed change of use from a nursing home to 6 flats is still excessive. We also understand the pressure on the number of care home beds in West Sussex. We are objecting to the proposal for the following reasons. The mass, bulk and proximity of the proposed altered rear ground floor extension and rear elevation would be overbearing and intrusive. This would affect all properties that back onto or are close to the structure, including but not limited to 14 and 16 Ripley Road. We will suffer severe and direct loss of privacy, and this will impact on the peaceful enjoyment of our home and garden. The conversion from nursing home to 6 flats will result in not only bedrooms, but also living room windows overlooking our home and garden. These will directly overlook and give clear visual access to the whole of our garden and the 2 bedrooms, dining room and kitchen at the rear of our home. 14 and 16 Ripley Road will be overlooked to a similar extent. The density of occupation has the potential to reach 17, which is far too many for the footprint of the building and exceeds the maximum number of residents who are permitted in the nursing home. The noise from 6 separate households will prove to be excessive and intrusive in such a confined area and small footprint. We recall that planning permission for a 2-storey extension has previously been refused. We also understand that part of the rear of the property was constructed without planning permission in the past. The large and mature apple tree at the end of our garden could be damaged as part of the construction work. This is not environmentally acceptable. In addition, all trees which could potentially be affected by the development, including those on adjoining properties, should be assessed by an arboricultural consultant in accordance with British standard. BS 5837 2012, trees in relation to design, demolition and construction recommendations, and details of this assessment should be submitted with the application. Whilst not part of the planning request, there is the potential for the green roof space to be used by residents as an informal garden area at both levels. This would be an intolerable intrusion from several occupants to our privacy. There would be nothing to prevent this happening. And finally, parking problems, already an issue in the area, and in particular Reigate and Ripley Road, will be exacerbated. There is the potential for up to 12 additional vehicles. Reigate Road is a busy cut through. Additional vehicles will cause traffic problems in close proximity to Elm Grove First School, with the related safety hazards for school children, many of whom walk to school, not to mention other motorists. And there could be further pressure on parking in adjoining roads, including our own, and the subsequent traffic dangers. That's the representation from Mr. Connor. The second representation has been submitted by Shelley Johnson. She states, "We appreciate the need to utilise a building which has been vacant for some time to reduce the much needed housing shortage for families in the borough. Our appeal against the resubmitted planning application are on several grounds which are still relevant and unresolved as listed below. This is a family housing street, and a high density development would have a negative impact. The subsequent resubmitted plans have not changed sufficiently enough to suggest this is otherwise. The number of occupants remains the same. Planning this development as a high density development leaves inadequate, no provision for parking. This would potentially add another 14 cars to off-street parking. Off-street parking is already inadequate, as borne out by the increased number of applications to the council for drop curbs in this road. Parents also use the bottom end of Reigate Road to park for dropping off and collecting their children at Elm Grove School, sometimes early and late, as Elm Grove is open from 8 till 6. Reigate Road is already used as a shortcut by traffic to the shops at Goring Mill Road, and as a cut through, cars are often above the speed limit, and with increased traffic due to high density development, the potential for accidents increases. Customers, businesses and their staff using the shops and the 3 supermarkets on Goring Road also park in Reigate Road. Elm Grove School intake now is up to Year 6. The catchment area is restricted to the streets directly surrounding the school. This supports the council commitment to reducing the carbon footprint, as these older children walk to school and have to cross Rugby Road and Reigate Roads. Increased traffic and parking from high density development could put these children at increased risk of a traffic incident. To that end, we ask in our objection for the Highways and Safety Traffic Department to take a proactive approach and review to make sure the child-friendly environment remains safe due to traffic increase. We've since read the Highway Authority's report. The recommendation was advice only, and the proposal had been considered by means of a desktop study. The Highways Authority offered a site visit on request. However, there is no report of a site visit taking place. This could explain perhaps the unawareness of the parking problems, congestion and safety. As per the Highways report, it stated there will be less reliance upon the private car in this location and that cycling would be available option. This scenario is unlikely, as the average car ownership in the southeast is the highest in the UK, with 1.3 to 1.4 cars per household. This planning proposal does not allow for shift workers, car ownership of tenants and homeowners, or the parking problems, noise and pollution this high density development would create, with potentially 14 occupants, if not more. This conclusion is advice only, and that it would not result in severe cumulative impact on the operation of a highway network are based on a desktop assessment. Previously, as a C2 use, had less need for long-term overnight parking as few staff overnight and only short-term parking requirement for visitors. Therefore, there would be significant more traffic movements and parking in the road with potential for cars. The development's out of keeping for the quiet private gardens surrounding the property and will have a detrimental adverse effect on loss of privacy, outlook, light and noise disturbance. There's been no mention if the flats will be for rent or sale. If they are for rental, then turnover of residents is more likely, leading to increased noise disturbance and increased traffic. Overdevelopment, poor design and high density makes this application not in keeping with a family residential area. This development revised application is clearly still too high density for this property. Would significantly outweigh any benefit to housing contribution to the borough. We would like to appeal the above application for the reasons above. The last representation is from Dawn Gibbs. And Chairman, excuse me while I take a quick drink.
No problem.
Not alcoholic, I should add.
I would hope not, Mr. Appleton.
Dawn Gibbs would like a committee to take into consideration the following. After examining the plans and as a person in the adjoining property, number 17, I would like to object to this application on the following grounds. The development is out of keeping for this quiet residential area and will have a detrimental and adverse effect on the outlook, light, noise and disturbance. The building has already been massively extended to the point at which it is overbearing. Any further development would exacerbate this to an unacceptable level. This planned development would overlook my garden with more windows and doors being added. The properties surrounding the development all have quiet private gardens, and this high density development is not in keeping with this. The existing fire escape at the rear of the property is to be replaced with patio doors and a Juliet balcony. The temptation to hop over the balcony and use the roof as a recreational area may be too much for some people, which would result in neighbours being unacceptably overlooked, as well as safety issues for people doing this. As there would be no control over future residents, may I suggest this is replaced with a window to prevent the possibility of this happening. There is also no provision whatsoever for parking. Parking in Reigate Road is already congested at peak times, with people visiting the local shops and parents dropping children off to school. The former residents of the nursing home did not drive, and the number of vehicles visiting was negligible. I believe the suggestion that there will be no significant impact on the local highway network or cause any strain to on-street parking is at best misleading. Cars are quite frequently parked across the drive of number 17 by people visiting the shops, etc., and this will only make it worse. To suggest that people living in the proposed flats would be unlikely to own a car is unrealistic. The application has an unacceptable high density of people for what was originally one house, and with less parking available and more activity all hours of the day, with regular deliveries from the likes of Amazon, grocery deliveries, etc., and more frequent visitors in the evening, such as friends and takeaway deliveries, this will only become worse. I would also like you to take into account an application for the development of a property in Ripley Road, which was rejected due to the high density and had to be resubmitted at a reduced rate, therefore setting a precedent for the area. The application also fails to mention if the flats are for sale or rent. If they are to be rented, there is likely to be a higher turnover of residents, which could lead to increased noise, disturbance, and lack of privacy. I'm not against this property being converted to flats, but feel the number of units is too high. I also strongly object to the patio doors, as I feel this will result in a lack of my privacy and will give me no area in my garden that I'm not overlooked. I think a development with less density and on a smaller scale that retained the existing parking or improved it would be much more in keeping with the area and not so detrimental to the local environment. That's the end of the representations, Chairman, and any questions during the debate, happy to answer those.
Thank you, James. We've now got Councillor Edward Crouch, one of the ward councillors for Marine Ward, who has asked to speak. Ed, welcome to the meeting. You've got up to a maximum of 5 minutes once you commence speaking. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Hello, committee. I won't take the full 5 minutes, but I will, and I won't rehearse what residents have already said through Mr. Appleton. Our colleagues from the 1970s and 1980s have an awful lot to answer for, because this property has been extended to the point of kind of ridiculousness. And when you look at it on its sort of street view and satellite view, you see how incongruous it has become to the local area. Now, that's obviously by the wayside, but there is something here that is important around intensification. Almost certainly what's being proposed wouldn't be acceptable in terms of extending to the extent that it has already been extended, if that makes sense. And I think what we're doing here is over-intensifying an area that has already had significant overbearing additions to it. In terms of the revised scheme, I think what this demonstrates, and the objections I think that residents have put forward, demonstrate the damage that is done when an application is made that is even more obnoxious to the residents than that which we are now left with. The previous application has been withdrawn, and we're now left with something that is marginally better. But actually, the concerns of the residents largely have not been taken account of. The idea of obscure glazing to increase some of the privacy is welcomed, but this issue around intensification, I think, is the core point that I think residents are translating. And looking at the significant change of use, this property originally was a family home, and it is now being carved up into what will be 6 small units. It's positive that they are all meeting the space standards, but Worthing deserves better than this. And certainly the 70s and the 80s were not a good period for our town generally, and a number of fine family homes were carved up into smaller units. We are left with a legacy of parking issues, of over-intensification, of a lack of outside amenity space, and all this is doing is adding to it. It's 2020, the 80s are a dim and distant memory, and we shouldn't be adding to problems that were created 30 plus years ago. The issue around the green roofs, on principle, the idea of some external amenity space being created is a positive thing. However, when taken in consideration with the residents and with neighbouring properties, having people, in flying gardens certainly doesn't seem to be appropriate in terms of privacy, and that amenity balance between the existing residents and the new residents seems to be somewhat in conflict. I won't wax on too much, but I think there is a point here, and I've sat on the planning committee, and I understand the balance that has to be struck between the existing residents and also the value added by new properties. You're adding six properties in to a relatively small area. It's a significant over-intensification. It's a significant change of use from a relatively sedate rest home into something that will have a much greater impact on residents. And I would just urge the committee not to make the mistakes that were made 30 years ago, and not to add a significant number of residential units into an area that is already extremely busy. Parking speaks for itself. There is not enough parking in Worthing. It's not a material planning consideration, but it is a practical consideration. And I know members of this committee have spoken out in the past for other areas where parking has been a concern. And I would ask them to just consider the practicalities, certainly given how busy and how popular Goring Road Shops is. Members, that's principally my submission. The over-intensification, significant change of use are my principal concerns, and I'm happy to take any questions that the committee may have, but hopefully my comments speak for themselves. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Crouch, and 45 seconds to spare. Well done. Right, members of the committee, have you got any questions for Councillor Crouch, just on clarification on anything that he said, please? If so, indicate. No? Right, thank you very much, Councillor Crouch. We've got no speakers down to speak to us in support of this application. So we will go straight into debate and discussion, members. Who wants to kick it off? Raise your hand, please. Councillor Paul Baker.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Well, I mean, I've looked at this property, and I've had a look at it from Google above, and yeah, it's just a complete mishmash of extensions on extensions. Quite frankly, I think that if we were to grant this planning permission, I'd feel really sorry for the local residents living on either side and to the rear of this, because this is just so overbearing and overlooking of what their gardens and the area itself. So I just really can't see this as being acceptable and as being an overdevelopment.
Thank you, Councillor Paul Baker. Who else has got any comments on this one, please? Mr. Appleton, you want to come in?
Yes, Chairman. I just, in response to Councillor Baker, really, because I'm concerned that we should be considering this as overdevelopment when actually it is just making use of existing floor space. I do take Councillor Crouch's point that this has been significantly extended in the past, but that floor space exists, and this is effectively a more modest reuse of that floor space in terms of the previous proposal by trying to make use largely of the existing, albeit that smaller 2-metre extension to the back of the garage. So this is really a reuse of the existing. There is already overlooking from the care home to adjoining properties, and there's an opportunity to slightly improve that situation by part obscure glazing the side elevation windows to numbers 17 and 21. As far as Ripley Road to the rear, I know there's been some concerns about replacing windows with patio doors, but at a distance of 25 metres, that really wouldn't cause overlooking. I would just, taking on the concerns of the neighbours, that one of the points is obviously potentially getting access onto those green roofs. The green roofs are proposed to help deal with the sustainable urban drainage system, and obviously the idea of the green roofs is not to provide additional amenity space. So I'd be quite happy, Chairman, for an additional condition to be added to prevent the use of green roofs. Clearly, the area that is going to be used as a roof terrace has a privacy screen to prevent overlooking. But I do take the points of neighbours if in the future those green roofs started to be used, that would exacerbate overlooking. So that would be an additional safeguard for committee to consider and to address some of the neighbours' concerns.
Thank you, Mr. Appleton. Councillor Jim Dean.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I kind of almost following on from James again. We are where we are. I mean, I think also we can't even lay the blame at the planning committee in the 1980s, because this was lost on, or it was presumably voted against in planning committee and was lost on appeal. So if you like, the damage was done then, and that horse has bolted and bolted several times again as further extensions have been added, with presumably without any planning applications to go with them. So we are where we are. The building is as it is, and that there are at the moment significant overlooking issues which are being addressed by this application. Having seen the previous application, and I do take Councillor Crouch's point, we shouldn't always assume that that was the one that was intended to go through, and they can be put up in order to make the subsequent one look better. I do think there has been a genuine attempt by the applicants here to answer some of the issues that were raised and were obvious problems with the original application. In particular, I think all but one of the apartments now have their own amenity space. That clearly is a very welcome addition. They're also 2-bedroom apartments rather than studio flats and single bedrooms, so they in effect cater for a rather different market, and one which I think we should be supporting. So I have an awful lot of sympathy with what's being said. However, I am kind of aware of the fact that that building exists. It has to have a use. This seems like a very genuine use and a very useful way of reusing that space, one which is clearly not going to go back to being a care home, because it probably doesn't meet the kind of standards that will be accepted now. Yes, I suppose it's possible that an even better application might come up, but this seems to me to tick a lot of the boxes. I think there is also the issue, there is an additional parking space created on the road because of the closing off of the driveway. There is bicycle provision. There are all sorts of additional facilities being created, which I think make this a genuinely beneficial application for the reuse of this building. And I think the residents, I think, maybe have got so used to the fact that it hasn't been used to this sort of intensity, but it could have been right up to the present day if it had maintained its use as a care home. But clearly it's been out of use for some time. It's now neglected and has been very quiet as a result. I think, so for that reason, I'm minded at the moment to support the recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Dean. James, you still got your hand up. Did you want to come back on something that Councillor Dean said, or you forgot to put your hand down? All right, Councillor Helen Silman, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I want to raise the question of the sustainability issues within the conversion that will take place if this is approved. And I just want to ask you, could you have got condition on a sound insulation scheme, condition 8, and you have a condition 12, including the green roofs in surface water disposal, but there's nothing at all about energy production or use. In particular, will each of the units, is it intended that there will be a common air pump system, or we certainly don't want 7 more gas boilers around there? And in general, could we have a condition to that effect?
James, you've got a couple of questions there.
Yes, I mean, obviously the scheme does include some sustainability measures in relation to the green roofs, but we don't have the detail of what they would do in terms of individual boilers, or whether they would make use of any renewable energy technology. Certainly there is the flat roof that could incorporate green roofs and potentially some PV panels. So I'm happy to add a condition that would require details of sustainable measures. Quite often these conversions do mean that you can get a better thermal insulation of the building, because quite often there's an upgrade in terms of replacing, you know, substandard windows and providing insulation with the sound insulation. But if we put the condition on, then we can make sure that we get the appropriate upgrades to the building from a sustainability point of view.
Councillor Silman, are you happy with that response?
Yeah, can I just come back with that? Yes, I am. Yes, I am. And thank you very much. And on the basis that there is that condition, I would approve the application.
Thank you. Councillor Dean, you've still got your hand raised. Was that a mistake, or did you want to come back on one of those points? No, you've gone. Councillor Smitherman.
There we go. Thank you, Chairman. Very interesting debate, actually. Very interested listening to the points that Councillor Crouch raised. Of course, it's very easy to sort of look back at the 70s and 80s with some sort of rose-tinted glasses, but actually, the world is a very different place. People don't live in those large houses anymore. Clearly, I would love to see that to still be a care home, as I'm sure many members would. It's simply just not a reality. I think the applicants made a really good job of this. I think, as James pointed out, I think we've got a really good opportunity to actually, you know, use obscure glazing and to protect the residents. So I'm very happy to support this. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Smitherman. It seems everything we do is an interesting debate. It's quite an accolade from someone like you, Councillor Smitherman. Councillor Noel Atkins.
Thank you, Chair. We've got the space. We may as well use it. The care home has gone, and it's a good solution, and I'm in support of this application. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Atkins. I've got no one else who is indicating to speak. I need someone to put a proposition to me, please. Councillor Noel Atkins, first hand up.
Thank you, Chair. I would propose that we accept this application. Thank you.
But okay, Councillor Smitherman, I assume you're going to second that.
Yes, please, Chairman.
There was talk of a couple of conditions added. Yes, Councillor Atkins, were you happy with those conditions to be added?
Yes, I am. To prevent the use of green roofs and the obscure glasses there.
And there was another one. I will, just before we go to vote on your proposal, I'll get Mr. Appleton just to clarify what those added conditions were. Mr. Appleton?
Yes, thank you. So there'll be a recommendation in the agenda with 2 additional conditions, one relating to the submission of details of sustainability measures to be incorporated into the conversion. And secondly, as Councillor Atkins has just mentioned, to prevent the use of the green roofs. The obscure glazing is covered in condition number 4. So it's just the 2 conditions relating to sustainability and preventing the future use of the areas of green roof.
So the sustainability one addresses Councillor Silman's points that she raised, does it?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, so to make it clear, Louise Matthew, you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. So you've clarified the proposal with the proposer, Councillor Atkins. Could we just get Councillor Smitherman to confirm that he is seconding that proposal with those 2 additional conditions, please?
Thank you. I was just going to go down that line, but yeah, Councillor Smitherman, are you happy to still second it with those 2 additional conditions?
Very happy to, Chairman, with those additional conditions. Thank you.
Right, thank you. So before I pass over to Heather, just to make it crystal clear, we are voting on accepting this application with those 2 additional conditions. So you're voting for approving the recommendation. Heather, can you go to the vote, please?
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Noel Atkins, for, against or abstain?
For.
Councillor Paul Baker, for, against or abstain?
Against.
Councillor Jim Dean, for, against or abstain?
For.
Councillor Karen Harman, for, against or abstain?
For.
Councillor Paul High, for, against or abstain?
Against.
Councillor Helen Silman, for, against or abstain?
For.
Councillor Bob Smitherman, for, against or abstain?
For.
And finally, Councillor Steve Wills, for, against or abstain? Councillor Steve Wills?
For.
For. 6 for and 2 against.
Okay, so that has been carried on a vote of 6 for and 2 against. Thank you. We move on to application 3, which is AWDM stroke 0108 stroke 20 Nursery Cottage, 12 Hurston Close. I believe Mr. Gary Peck, you're presenting this one to us.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I am. I'll come into
Excuse me. Oh yeah, sorry, Louise had her hand up, but she took it down now. Louise, did you want to come in? Louise Matthew? Louise Matthew, you've got your hand up. Did you want to say something? Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, sorry,
Thank you.
Councillor. Hi, a couple of technical issues there. I believe that we're going to consider maybe a short adjournment just for a couple of minutes before moving on to the next item.
Are we?
I just added it saying if you can suggest a comfort break, it's up to you, Chair.
The time is now on here 2019. I propose, if the committee are in agreement, we adjourn for 5 minutes. We'll call it 20. We'll adjourn till it's gone to 2020 now. We'll adjourn till 25 past. Okay. Right. 5 minutes. How are we doing, Heather? Is everyone back yet? Heather, can you check that the whole committee are back online, please?
Noel Atkins, yes. Paul Baker. Jim Dean.
Can you respond, please, committee members?
Jim Dean. Karen Harman. Paul. Helen Silman. Councillor Bob Smitherman. Yeah.
Present.
And Councillor Steve Wills.
Present.
They're all present, Chair.
Charlie, please. Right, thank you. Gary, do you want to continue with the presentation for this application, which is Nursery Cottage, 12 Hurston Close, Worthing, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Item 3. There's nothing further to add to the report by way of representation, so I can go straight into the presentation, which starts with the overhead view on the screen now. I'll then show the plans and some photographs. So starting with the site itself, the overhead view here shows the site before it was developed. It is a backland site, and it's where the red circle is at the moment, where the cursor is circling. As we'll see from photographs at the moment, the dwelling is located on this part, this western side of the site, and the eastern element also forms part of the site where the dwelling has been built. As members will see, the application is a retrospective application, and essentially there are three parts to it. They are the retention of dormers, the retention of a porch, and steps to the rear elevation, which is the western elevation in this case. Onto the site plan, just to show members that briefly, and if I just pull this plan down just to show what was shown there on the bird's eye, we can see that the access is from the south here in Hurston Close, where the cursor is circling. And as I said a moment ago, the dwelling's on this part here and the garage on the eastern part of the application site. And just showing that in more detail, we can see therefore the dwelling here where the cursor is circling, the access here, again where the cursor is at the moment, and the garage here. The porch, which is the subject of the application, is here where the cursor is circling, and the two dormers on this part here, they're also on the western elevation, as are the steps up to the rear door area. So then going on to the plans that are submitted with the application, and the key ones just to look at on these plans here is the first floor plan, and in particular with regard to the dormers. As members will see in the reports, these dormers are blind dormers at present, but they are lit from above where the cursor is circling by existing roof lights. So that's there and there. We can also see that on the section where the cursor is at that point as well. As also stated in the report, as you can see, one of the rooms that the dormers serve is a bathroom. Coming then down into elevation form, sorry, I'll just go back up one page there and just bring this plan down again. Into elevation form, the dormers shown here on the second left plan there, that's the western elevation. So these are, sorry, the fourth plan along the western elevation here. So these are the blind dormers that are the subject of the application, which I'll show a photograph of in a moment. These are the doors that are served by the steps leading up, where the dormer is here and here. And on this third plan is the porch. The porch is the first element we'll see in the photographs. And again, if I just pull this photograph out, this is taken from the accessway, in other words, to the south of the dwelling. And we can see here the porch is at that place there on the eastern elevation, and which forms part of this application. Next photograph just steps down a little bit. That's the driveway. So let's just turn around just to show members the entrance from Hurston Close. That looks in a southerly direction. And then the first photograph where we get a glimpse of the dormers is taken from within the site. So this is close to the back wall of the dwelling, the western elevation. As we can see, the dormers are here. Here. On to the next photograph. This is the steps up to the rear elevation. So previously, it was anticipated that this would be flat with the doors at ground level. So we can see the level of the dwelling is actually above the ground level, and therefore the steps here and here have been constructed at the rear to serve the balcony doors and the step into this paved area at the rear. That's the western boundary of the application site, and that's looking in a northerly direction. And then if we come on to the next photograph, this one looks in a southerly direction, and we can then see some of the properties that border the site to the south in Hurston Close. So again, we can see the steps there at that point and that point, and the nearest residential property behind that. Moving on to the next photograph. This is a photograph when I was stood on the steps. So this is adjacent to those back patio doors you've just seen when standing on the steps. As we can see from this photograph, it is possible to see over the fence into the properties here, Hurston Close, at this point and this point. If I then come down off those steps in the next photograph onto the ground level, the first floor of the properties is still clearly visible, as you can see, but the ground floor has disappeared, and accordingly, it is suggested at the end of your reports on page 48 that a condition number 7 is imposed to require trellis fencing along here to block the view, if I go back to the previous photo, to reduce the view of these ground floor elements here that can only be seen as a result of the steps. Just to clarify for the purposes of the western elevation, At present, that fence there is higher than the one that serves the southern elevation. And as you can see, there is no overlooking. Again, that stood on the steps there, and that at present does not provide any overlooking of the adjoining property to the west. So that concludes the presentation, Chair. I don't have any representations to read out, and I'll stop sharing the screen now. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Members, have you got any questions for Gary on the presentation? Anything for clarification or any points? If so, please raise your hand. Councillor Paul Baker, please.
Yes, Gary, can you just clarify what the relevant planning history on this development has been? Because reading through the notes, it looks like that these dormers were refused in December 2019. Is that correct?
Yes, Councillor Baker, that is correct, but it was a procedural issue, and it's picked up in terms of some of the representations that neighbours have raised. Neighbours have raised concerns that windows will be inserted into those dormers subsequently. The application we received at the back end of last year was a non-material amendment application. They are not full planning applications, they simply amend an existing consent. And the purposes of those is that you can't then add any additional conditions. So therefore, procedurally, had we approved that application, it then would have been impossible for us to prevent the insertion of windows in those dormers in the future. So it wasn't a planning assessment as such, it was simply that the procedure was incorrect because we wouldn't be able to prevent the insertion of windows if it's not a full planning application. Clearly, in this case, because it is now a full planning application, we can then impose a condition withdrawing permitted development rights, which would mean that the insertion of windows in those blind dormers would require a future planning application that would need to be considered by this committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Members, any more questions for clarification on Gary's? Councillor Helen Silman, please.
Thank you. Yes, Gary, page 46, the penultimate paragraph, which deals with the issue you've just mentioned. And of course, I would like to see a condition that glazing cannot take place in the future without a further planning permission. But if it is done without that planning permission and another retrospective application comes back, can you explain to me the bit in bracket, the expediency of any subsequent enforcement action? Does that mean that there will never be an enforcement action if glazing is put in the dormer windows in the future, which would require then a retrospective application?
No, this goes back to how we deal with retrospective applications, which must be that the planning merits are strictly considered, irrespective of whether the application is retrospective or not. I don't know if it'll help to go back to share the screen, but in the case of glazing in those western-facing dormers, perhaps if I do just share my screen for the moment, if I just come back into my presentation, because it may assist, if I can just come back up to the very first item. My view as an officer, if an application was submitted to insert dormers, which would be in this area here for the glazing rather into the dormers here, that would quite clearly overlook these properties to the west. There would be absolutely no grounds to grant permission for that. So even if retrospective, I think the applicant would be very ill-advised to do that, because I think there would be a clear planning justification to refuse that application, and hence therefore a clear justification for taking enforcement action. So in that case, that would be expedient. So I think the glazing is quite clearly a critical concern. So hopefully that's what I meant by that paragraph. I think that if that was done retrospectively, the applicant would have little chance of success.
Thank you for clarifying that. Thank you.
Right, members, any more questions for Gary on the presentation in front of us? No? Right, okay. I'm now going to ask Lizette Bull is objecting to this. Lizette, can you read out? You'll have 3 minutes from the time you commence speaking, please. Lizette.
Right, let me. Oh, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can indeed.
Hello, good evening, Mr. Chairman. Okay, firstly, I would like you to consider the following points prior to your approval of the above application. The original plans that were submitted were declined due to the scale of the build. The plans were then revised and approved subject to certain terms and conditions. These terms and conditions were not adhered to during the build, and both myself and my neighbours have suffered damage to our properties and cars throughout the process of this. I contacted the council on numerous occasions, advising them, i.e. of materials stored on the pavement, which is a hazard, blocking the road so we couldn't park outside of our properties, and out of hours working, etc. Mr. Meredith has now built a property with added blind dormers, which we know will have windows at a later date and evade the privacy of residents on the Findon Road. A porch that looks directly into my bedroom windows, as you can see out there tonight, with lights as well, shining into my property and added security lights as well, which are always going off, obviously, due to the amount of cats that are around here. Not to mention the view of the trees that I've obviously lost as well. The size of this build should never have been agreed for this small plot, which has now been shoehorned in. I would also like to know, when planning permission is obviously granted originally, subject to terms, conditions X, Y, and Z, why are these, when these are not adhered to, Mr. Meredith can build, as I say, what he likes. And as I say, it's not on really. So therefore, I'd like you to thoroughly consider this application prior to the approval. Thank you.
Thank you, Lizette Ball. Gary, do you want to address some of those points that Lizette raised there?
Yes, Chairman, maybe just a quick point of clarification for members. If I may, I'll just go back and share the screen again, because there was reference to an earlier refusal again, and members will see in their report that originally there was an application refused first off for dwelling on this site. But at that point, the application site only consisted of this part here. That was the very first application that was refused. It didn't have this part here where the house is actually located. There was a dwelling that was in this part here, and officers clearly were concerned about that, and the site area almost doubled subsequently. So what we did eventually grant was very different to the first refusal. I'll come back off screen now. In respect of the last point, yes, officers were very quickly aware of a number of breaches at this application site, and they have been more or less continuous through its construction. However, the normal way of doing that in the planning process is to request a retrospective application, and that's what you have before you now to consider. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Members, have you got any questions for Lizette Ball for clarification on what she said? If so, raise your hand. No? Right, we'll move on. We've now got Paul Meredith, who's, I believe, is in the meeting, is speaking up as a supporter for this. Paul, you'll have 3 minutes, up to a maximum of 3 minutes to speak once you start commencing. And welcome to the meeting.
Hello, Chairman. Thank you very much. Hope everyone's safe, and I'd like to give my little bit into the meeting. I'd like to point out that the chalet bungalow has been fitted perfectly into its surroundings without blocking out anyone's light or overlooking anybody's personal area. What was formerly a piece of land used for dumping rubbish by certain neighbours has now been returned to an excellent, versatile family home. On that case, I would like to say that from a development point of view, this is backland development that has taken place and has fitted in my opinion, perfectly. Unfortunately, you will always upset one person, and from that, I can't turn the clock back. But there we are, that's where we are. And I'd like to thank the planning team and the enforcement officers for guidance throughout the build process. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you, Mr. Meredith. Members, have you got any questions for Mr. Meredith on what he has just said? If so, raise your hand. No? Well, in that case, we will go into the debate. Members, can if you wish to speak, can you raise your hand, please? Councillor Helen Selman.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, it's not the first time I've said this. My heart sinks when I see these retrospective applications coming in, because one of the purposes of planning practice and legislation, and I know the officers try, and I believe all the members of the committee try very hard to balance one person's wants and desires with another person's. And the result of the first application was that the neighbours had to accept, even if they didn't want it, that there would be a new property here on this backland. And it was subject to conditions, and a certain form was agreed. And then the builder developer does something different, and within the law is required to come back with an application, a new planning application, to approve what he has already done in contradiction to the original permission. And I don't like it, and I know what the law is. So in this particular case, my sympathies are with the neighbours and the person who has just objected. Subject to the condition which Gary has said can be applied, I would have to accept this and the officer's advice, but I want it recorded. I do not like this kind of behaviour.
Thank you,
Can I just say, I'm sorry, just one more sentence, and to say that I am never surprised. 12 months ago, I was very surprised when residents said to me, we don't like the planning system, we don't trust the planning system, we don't like anything about planning, because it's always against the interests of the weaker person, if you like, the neighbours. And now I do understand that. It doesn't gain respect for the planning process when this kind of thing happens.
Thank you, Councillor Silman. Any other members want to speak? Councillor Jim Dean.
Really just backing up what Councillor Silman has said, it really is, it does create a nonsense of the planning system when people just flout no is a particular application, and they know what was approved and they know what wasn't approved, and then they flout it and come back and try and if like push through changes which weren't accepted originally. It's extraordinarily frustrating for everybody concerned, and particularly for neighbours who had a certain expectation of what would happen as a result of the application being passed. I'm comforted to know that in this case, these blind dormers will now, it will be very difficult, and I'm sure the neighbours will make it absolutely sure that it will be very difficult for any windows to be put into them. To me, they look absolutely hideous on the building, but there we are. That's just a matter of opinion. You know, for me, dormers have a particular purpose, which is, and I know there are windows in the top, but they look rather odd without them on the side. But anyway, I'm comforted to know they won't actually, it won't actually be possible without a further full application for that to be done, and that it would likely be objected to on the grounds overlooking. But it is desperately frustrating when this kind of thing happens.
Thank you, Councillor Dean. Gary, can you just confirm and explain again what the extra condition that you said has been put on about the fencing? I believe it was about fencing, wasn't it?
Yes, Chair, that is a condition that's in your report. It is just because of the steps that have been added to the rear. When you stand on the top of them, that allows the ground floors of the properties, including that of the speaker, to be seen from the top of those steps. I don't see there's any necessity for that to be the case. So therefore, a condition is proposed to increase the height of that fence, possibly by a trellis, as suggesting the condition, that will then more or less block out the view of the ground floor that's been obtained from the insertion of those steps. There is a withdrawal permitted development condition as well, as mentioned by Councillor Silman. Thank you.
Okay, and I assume, should we approve this tonight, that extra condition will have to be enforced, will it?
Yes, it will. And I know how frustrating it is, because I share members' frustration and have done ever since I became a planning officer. We receive these applications, and very often it seems that, has been suggested, that it favours the person who has done the works. But we do have to assess these on planning grounds. But having said that, I think the conditions we've imposed now are there for a reason. They're there for good reason. I.e., if windows overlook the western garden, we would have a clear reason for planning refusal. And equally, I think that because of the standing on the steps, which now allows a view of the ground floor of those properties, I think we're perfectly justified in increasing the height of the fence as well. So I think if those conditions aren't complied with, to my mind, my professional recommendation is that we'd have good grounds for taking enforcement action if those conditions aren't complied with. So in that instance, that's where the planning merits, if you like, would then tip in favour of the objectors. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. That's quite helpful. Councillor Dean, you've got your hand up again. Did you want to come back? No? Does any other members want to speak on this? Councillor Paul Baker.
Yes, I think really I'm only echoing what Councillor Dean and Councillor Silman have said, really. I think all of us that sit on planning hate it when we see planning decisions basically being road roughshod over. We're once again presented with a fait accompli that all we can do is try and ensure that nothing else happens on this site. I'm satisfied that the conditions will be in place to ensure that, but certainly as a councillor, one of the biggest objections I get from the public is when planning permission is granted and that planning permission is not adhered to. We all hate it. We all hate seeing it. There's nothing we can do about it, unfortunately. Only ensure that conditions going forward prevent any more of these flagrant disregard of planning regulations and enforcements.
Thank you, Councillor Baker. Does any other members want to speak? Right, can I have a proposition from somebody, please? Councillor Smitherman.
Thank you, Chairman. And I sympathise with what previous colleagues have said about respective applications. It's a long time since I've sat on planning, and I understand how frustrating it is. I really appreciate the work that Gary and his team have done to reach a compromise here, and I think we should support this with those additional conditions. So therefore, I'm happy to propose that we support this with those additional conditions and ensure that they're enforced. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Smitherman. Councillor Noel Atkins.
I'd like to second the proposal.
Thank you. So for clarification, we've got a proposition by Councillor Smitherman, seconded by Councillor Noel Atkins, to approve this recommendation with the associated added conditions that are on there. Heather, can you go to the vote, please?
Thanks, Chair. Councillor Noel Atkins, for, against, or abstain?
For.
Councillor Paul Baker, for, against, or abstain?
Abstain.
Councillor Jim Dean, for, against, abstain?
For.
Councillor Karen Harman, for, against, or abstain?
For.
Councillor Paul High, for, against, or abstain?
For the first time tonight, for.
Councillor Helen Silman, for, against, or abstain?
For.
Councillor Bob Smitherman, for, against, abstain?
For.
And finally, Councillor Steve Wills, for, against, or abstain?
Can you unmute Councillor Wills, please?
Yeah. 4.
Thank you. 7-4 and 1 abstention. Thank you,
Okay,
Chair.
so that application has been approved. Thank you. We move on to the last item on the agenda tonight, which is AWDM stroke 1008 stroke 19, the former EDF car park on South Downview Road, Worthing. Gary, you're presenting this one as well, I believe.
Yes, thank you, Chair. On to item which is number 2 on your agenda. And I just have one further addition to the report to members, and that relates to part of the report on page 31. There is mention of the provision of cable ducting for the remaining car parking spaces where appropriate to provide passive provision for those spaces to receive electric vehicle charging points in the future. I can confirm that the applicant has agreed to that, and therefore that cable ducting can be provided. To that extent, therefore, I would suggest a slight amendment to condition 26 to ensure that that provision is made, and that therefore all of the spaces on the application site, in addition to those 49 that already have EV charging points proposed, will have the ability to provide such EV points in the future. So onto the presentation, and on the screen at the moment is the application site circled in red. It is the rear part behind the former EDF building, which has permission for a residential conversion stated in your report. This is an area currently a car parking area that served the former building. The access to the site, as I'll show in a minute, comes here from the western side, and then the units will be provided in here. And as members will see in the report, there are 22 of those units in all altogether. Onto the plans first off, and just to show first off, I'll just come down to this one here, just to confirm that the access is from the western side. Sorry, that plan has just skipped over. We can just see here South Downview Road. I'll come across in red here. The application access site is here, and the proposed units would be in this point. This blue line here indicates that the applicant has control owns the adjoining land, and that's the part where the residential conversion with permission will take place. The next plan is just a site plan showing levels. For members familiar with the site, there is a watercourse that runs around the side on the northern side, almost effectively a small ditch, in fact. And this plan here confirms that the application site just follows the watercourse, which is just here, just the point where it comes around here. It's a very narrow ditch, so that's the extent of the application site, just shown on that particular plan. The next one is the site plan, and this is the most informative. As stated in the report, therefore, there are 5 separate blocks providing 22 units. The first block is here. This provides 8 units here. That's named as unit 1, but there are 8 individual units within it. Unit number 2 here provides a further 4, just where the cursor is. Unit 3 has a sort of island in the middle of the site that provides a further 2. Those units are slightly higher than the rest. In general, these buildings are 7 metres in height, but this unit here is about 8. Onto the southern part is unit 4, and that provides a further 6 units, and then the 5th block here providing a further 2 units. So these configurations will provide a number of different sized units for light industrial use. As I mentioned a moment ago, the access is here from South Downview Road on the western side. So the access comes in at this point here. There is a footpath, a continuous footpath, just to stress, on the northern side that leads into the site. And there will be a fence provided here to separate the access from the residential properties that were permitted in here under permitted development. As we can see off the plan, there are 97 parking spaces provided around the application site, and there are also provision for 48 cycling spaces, just where my cursor is circling here, here, and over here as well. Members will also note in the report there are some existing small trees on the site which will be lost as a result of the proposal. There will be additional planting towards the edge of the site, and the officers feel that that is an acceptable replacement. The existing site section that I'm showing now really just shows the extent of the converted building on the application site. As you can see, that's quite a tall building, and really the purpose of the section here is just to demonstrate to members that the proposed buildings now shown in the darker profile are lower than those buildings that surround them to the west, and indeed a number of the other buildings on the wider industrial estate are of a higher height and bigger height and scale than the ones proposed here. We then just have plans for all of the individual units, and largely these look the same, and really their only difference is the number proposed within them. This is the larger block number 1 with the 8 units, fairly standard design that you'd find on an industrial estate when serving light industrial units. So that's 8 in a row, and that sits centrally within the site. Number 2, block 2 there with the next 4 units, again a very similar profile and similar height. On then to the 3rd unit. These are configured, as I mentioned a moment ago, slightly differently, and so therefore the height of these is a little bit higher, with a slightly higher eaves height, but because they sit centrally within the site rather than on the borders, your officers are not concerned about that slight increase compared to the other units. Onto the 4th block, that's the 2nd largest out of the 5 proposed, and that's another 6 units here, again very similar in design to the ones we've seen previously. And lastly, onto the 5th unit, which also provides those 2 blocks that have a similar height. That completes the plans and the photographs now. In many ways similar to the first one, similar to what you've already seen. We'll just go through these overhead views. So this one is looking in a northerly direction, again, just to confirm the axis is on this part here to the right, and the units will be located within this part here. So that's a standard north view. This is then bending round, looking to the west. And we can see here the Rayner building that is adjacent to the application site is a substantial building, and the proposed buildings will be rather low in comparison to that particular building, relatively recently built. That's a western view, and this is a southern view again showing the scale of that building there and that one there, with the proposed units centrally located in the site. Then some photographs. At the time this one was taken, the site was at that stage still fenced off. That's looking towards the access. So the access here, there is, as we can see, a sufficient width to it, and that will then provide access to those units behind that. And that then shows the building to be converted into residential use. Standing back slightly, a view to the south here, so it's just slightly outside the application site, but the access will be just behind where that hedge is. Then looking in a northeasterly direction, just confirm they are the properties that are all the buildings that are being converted into residential use. And not only do we have those buildings in future residential use, but as members will be aware, there are residential properties that sit on the western side of South Downview Road. The access point is here though, and the officers do not feel there'll be an additional harmful impact in that respect. That's again looking back to the south, and you can see here the access is of a sufficient width and radius to serve the development. That's into looking across the site from the adjacent cash and carry warehouse. So that's looking back into there. As we can see, because of the height of this building, the lower height of the industrial units will be relatively well screened from that particular viewpoint. And then these are just some last photographs within the residential conversion when it was taking place. And again, we can see the scale of the building that sits to the south of the application site, and looking across the site itself, which clearly now is an undeveloped area within an industrial estate. And then one last one looking across. As we can see, there is some screening beyond the site boundaries to sufficiently mitigate any wider views, but nonetheless it is an industrial estate in any case. So as stated in the report, there is a need for such accommodation within the town. That's been long recognised by the local plan, and subject to the addition to condition 26 to ensure that passive provision is made for the remaining parking spaces for EV points. The recommendation is as printed. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Members, have you got any questions for Gary on the report as he has presented it to us, please, for clarification or questions?
Sorry, Chair, can I just intervene? It seems that the live stream is paused momentarily. Can we just pause the meeting while I see if I can get it back?
Okay, let us know when you got it back.
Okay, Chair, it's working again.
Okay, thank you. We're at the stage of just asking questions on the report. We're not into open discussion as yet. Councillor Helen Silman, please.
Oh, I'm open. Can you hear me, Chair?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Page 38, top paragraph. You see how much I learned from Tevill Gate? Always have the page number ready. It's a question, the second sentence, which I could read out, notwithstanding the details shown on the submitted site plan, it is considered further consideration should be given to the construction design of the proposed acoustic barrier and its precise siting in relation to the above mentioned footpath and ground floor windows. I want to know, has there been further consideration to the design and siting?
Gary?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yes, there has, Councillor Silverman. I'm sorry I didn't clarify that in the report. There have been discussions recently about firstly the footpath itself on the northern side, and then also the provision of the fencing to serve to separate the footpath and the residential properties. It is felt it's a matter we can deal with by condition. As I understand it, at first the applicant just wished to put a standard panel fence up, which we felt would be a bit harsh. We've now gone into, I think, a stated in the report, a fence where it's, I think, an acoustic one where some plants can climb over it to soften the barrier. So our concern was firstly that the footpath that served the development wasn't of a sufficient width for pedestrians to access the site, but equally then the applicant had just suggested they were going to run a standard close-boarded fence up the boundary, which when it has residential properties close by it. So I think we've covered that point. It can be controlled by condition if necessary.
Thank you. As I say, we're not into discussion about this yet, members. It's only questions on the report. Councillor Noel Atkins, please.
No, I haven't finished.
Well, you can. I'll let you come. I'll let you come back in a while. Councillor Noel Atkins, please.
I apologise.
Thank you, Chair. Question for Gary on the presentation. In the condition 12, it talks about car parking spaces maximum of 97, and yet on the previous page it talks about parking spaces 1 per 30 square meters, which would actually give you 81 spaces. Could you clarify that, please?
Gary? Gary?
Sorry, Chairman, just had a bit of trouble unmuting there, but I think I'm back on now. Yes, Councillor Atkins, in actual fact, seeking condition 12, that both the car parking spaces and the cycle parking spaces differ to what is in there. We have to be careful, ironically, with parking provision that we don't over-provide parking, but having said that, given the nature of surroundings, we do feel it's appropriate to provide the 97 if we're offered them in this instance. So as such, an over-provision could be welcomed. We have also a minimum of 20 cycle parking spaces. Again, that's a standard we'd normally expect. In actual fact, we've got 48 on this site. So I think in part because of the way the site's been developed, the parking spaces and the cycle parking spaces probably dictate themselves. And indeed, I suspect, having looked at the layout, there may even be some more informal car parking spaces that could be fitted in front of the units themselves. I think probably the key point is we shouldn't worry about any overflow onto surrounding roads as a result of this development, because we do appear to have sufficient car parking provision. Thank you.
Gary, your sound is breaking up pretty badly. I think we can all hear you, but it seems to be getting continually worse. Councillor Karen Harman.
Can I just ask, is there any details of the actual accommodation, that the floor plans, anything, any pictures at all of what the accommodation will be like?
Gary?
Yes, I'm sorry, I've got some problems here with my laptop because everyone else is breaking up as far as I can hear them. I think Councillor Harman's question was about the accommodation of the units. They're basically the same. They're standard industrial units of a rectangular type on the we saw. They do vary so much. That might help, I don't know. But they do vary in size. There are some smaller units and some larger ones, but they're all B1 class units.
Thank you. Councillor Atkinson Harbour, can you turn your hands off, please? Councillor Bob Smitherman.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I hope Gary can hear. Really helpful presentation. Can I just seek some clarity about the 22 B1C units? I'm not an expert on B1C. 22 seems quite a lot. And I'm just wondering how, kind of what sort of things that cover and how much flexibility there is if we find out that actually there isn't the need for 22 B1Cs. Thank you, Chairman.
Gary?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yes, I heard that question just about there. Firstly, in terms of B1C, they are light industrial units. The planning definition of those are that they can be accommodated normally in a residential area without detriment to the amenities of surrounding residential properties. So in other words, they are, if you like, a light industry compared to a heavy industry. I think in the past, our local plan has always shown such a deficit of the provision of industrial floor space, and there are many firms that I see we have trouble accommodating within the town, that I would very much hope, from what I've heard in the past, there will be sufficient demand. But equally, there would be the opportunity for the applicant, if so wished, to apply to change use of those units. My understanding is that they do feel there's sufficient demand for this type of use on the site. And as I say, I think it has been long held in the town that we've got a shortage of being able to provide such accommodations. So hopefully it will work out okay. If not, the applicant would be open to change the conditions and come back with a different type of use. But as I say, I think there'll be sufficient demand. Thank you.
Right, Councillor Jim Dean.
Thank you very much, Chairman. It's a very, very minor point. Page 30, third paragraph down, we're not allowing any deliveries or collections between 8 and 17. I think there is an except between 8 hours, 8:00 hours and 17 hours. It is actually correct in the details at the end in the conditions, but it's incorrect in the report. Just needs an except put in there before between. Thank you.
Yeah, you're quite correct. I've just read that. Can that be amended, Gary, please?
Yes, sorry, I'm having trouble. I'm losing. Yes, congratulations, Councillor Dean. You spotted this month's deliberate mistake in the agenda. So well done on that. The key thing is correcting the conditions, as you correctly say. So we need not worry about that too much further. But certainly well done on spotting that little error.
Thank you. Councillor Silman, you wanted to come back on another point?
Yes, thank you, Chair. No, it's in connection with the acoustic fences again. Conditions 19 and condition 28 both refer to these acoustic fences. One is on the north side of the site and one is on the west. Why is there a difference in height? One is 2 meters and one is 2.4 meters.
Gary?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yes, thank you, Councillor Stillman. That's because the fences have two different purposes, really. The first one is to separate between the residential properties and the industrial units. The other one is simply as a barrier, a security barrier around the rest of the site for industrial units, where you might expect a slightly higher fence for security reasons. So that would explain the variation. So we separated those out because we're not trying to achieve the same thing with the two fences, if you like.
Thank you, Gary. Well, we've no speakers either for or against this one, so we go straight into discussion. I'm going to use my chairman's prerogative and speak first. I think this is great. This is using up an unused bit of land in an industrial estate. It is going to create jobs. It's going to create a more economy for Worthing, and I applaud it. And I think this is the sort of thing that Worthing needs. It needs things like this on bits of barren land, not just housing. I'm all for the housing and to get enough places for people to live, but I like to see things like this come along, which is boosting the economy and boosting business. And I applaud this, and I will certainly be voting for it. And I'll use my chairman's prerogative to actually propose that we accept this. Right, I've got Councillor Silman.
Thank you. Yes, Chair, I agree with you. It is a really, really good use of the land, and I know that we need these light industrial units. The questions that it arises in my mind are its proximity to the residential units which were created under permitted development. So it's very unusual to find 78 flats more or less in the middle of a light industrial estate. And I think the two issues which arise are the noise and the air quality for those people living in the residential units. And it's clear that the officers, through conditions and in various reports, have tried very, very hard to address these two issues, which will impact the people living in those flats, because really it's irreconcilable. Although you can mitigate, you can't remove the fact that there are going to be a lot of vehicles coming and going, potentially quite a lot of noise, loading and unloading. I don't know what kind of machinery might be used in any of these units, but it is as it is. So what I really want to ask the officers, through conditions, are you satisfied, for example, air quality? Idling should be added to the list of noise aspects, because idling of car engines is both an air pollutant and a noise pollutant. And although in a moment, I'll get back to it, the numbers of things listed that create noise, including the forklift trucks and various other things, it should include idling, and there should be a condition requiring signage to prevent idling wherever vehicles are going to be loading and unloading. It's a real menace, people who will not turn off their engines when they're loading and unloading. It only takes a few seconds to turn it off and then turn it on again. That's one thing. The second thing is each of these units, from the sustainability point of view, have they got free rein to put in their own heating and cooling systems? And shouldn't we add something that every unit, however it is fitted out, should be done in accordance with the highest sustainability standards? Oh, this is a discussion, yes. So that's another thing I would like a condition about. That sustainability issues must be included when each of the units is let.
Thank you, James Appleton. You've put your hand up. Did you want to come in on those points, or was it something before that?
No, it's just on the general point about amenity. And just to say, in this case, I think we've got the best of both worlds. We couldn't control the loss of the building to residential, but there was at one stage a threat that they would argue that the whole site should go to residential because the curtilage buildings could also be developed for residential. So I think we've been working with the applicants and encouraging them down the route of providing employment on the rear half of the site. I think the key thing about the B1C use category is that it's a use that can be carried out in a residential area without causing any harm. And the list of things that are referred to under that use class would include things like smell, nuisance, and deliveries and everything else. So there is a lot of control through just making sure that they're only used for light industrial. And I think, as you've heard, we have added a number of conditions to mitigate any potential noise impact. You could just rely on the B1C category without those additional conditions, but we've got a belt and braces here in terms of hours of use, acoustic fencing and controls. And certainly we're happy to, but be careful about the sustainability, because obviously they are industrial units, but I certainly take the point about then subsequently alterations that might fit heating and fit alterations to the buildings that might be done in an unsustainable way. So we could certainly look at a condition that might cover that off in terms of making sure that we do ensure that through the occupation of these that they install sustainable means of heating and energy production.
Thank you, James. Councillor Paul Baker.
I haven't finished. You just again.
Yes. I mean, we spend a lot of time at planning looking at the need for additional housing, and of course there is, but of course additional housing means we need additional jobs as well. During this unprecedented time where with the virus and everything like that, there's been a big movement to small businesses and to manufacturing becoming the core business of this country again. And small businesses like this are the ones that are stepping up to the plate, being flexible, adaptable, producing PPE, getting us through this crisis time. I am totally in support of the small industrial units with flexibility for the businesses that are in them, that will actually go a long way to rebuilding not only the economy of Worthing and providing jobs for the people of Worthing, but for rebuilding the economy of the country. I'll be totally in support of it.
Thank you, Councillor Paul Baker. Councillor Bobby Smiderman.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Yeah, Councillor Baker said everything that I would have said, really. I think what James Appleton said, I think, was really, really helpful. I would be increasingly concerned if we were to add additional conditions that was going to make it very difficult for the applicant in this case. For all the reasons that you said, Chairman, in your proposal, which if you're looking for a seconder, you'll certainly get that from me. I think it's really important that we support this and we don't put an additional burden on the applicant, because I would hate to think that we put additional conditions on a proposal like this, which is going to have huge benefits for all the reasons that Councillor Baker has said, and therefore I would support the proposal with the original condition as suggested by Gary around the EV, but I wouldn't support any more onerous conditions than that. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'd take it you're seconding my proposal. Councillor Noel Atkins.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to second your proposal, but Bobby's done that. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Helen Silman, you wanted to come back.
I did. It's about the travel plan on page 39. A question was raised, and I don't know if it's yet been answered, Gary, you could tell me. There are no shower or changing facilities for the cyclist shown on the plan. Has it now been included?
Gary?
This is very important for the travel plan.
Not specifically, Chair, in terms of a detailed plan for that. I would certainly expect there would be provision within some of the individual units. We could look at that again in terms of the floor plans. We do have to remember that internal floor plans can be changed without recourse to the council, but we certainly could discuss with the applicant their intentions on that. One thing, of course, to consider is that if we do have a travel plan condition, and that is shown as a shortage of those travel plan measures, then they wouldn't comply with that condition. So in some senses, the condition takes care of itself. I think probably at this juncture, I'd probably echo what Councillor Smitherman has said, is that to impose any further conditions now might be a bit onerous at the letting stage, but if at the travel plan stage, when these things are reviewed, you know, a couple of months into the opening of the units, for example, and we find that to be a particular shortage of the travel plan initiatives, then again we can look at it at that stage, and that might be the more appropriate timing, given the nature of what's being proposed here.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I agree with that. Just one more thing, because I'm ignorant. Can car charging points also be used for electric bikes? Because more and more people are getting electric bikes now. Would there be different kind of chargers needed?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that, Councillor Silverman. It's something I can try and find out. There may be some other more technically gifted members than myself. I don't know the answer to that, but
I may be able to answer you that one. Most electric bikes can work off a normal 13 amp plug top.
Thank you.
Councillor Jim Dean.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Yeah, I mean, obviously, very much in support of anything that improves employment opportunities, and this is clearly meeting a need which we have in Worthing already. It is slightly ironic that it's for the same developer that removed a great many employment opportunities by using permitted development to develop the rest of the site as housing, and in effect we're going through contortions to try and meet the needs of that change in the one that's now being created by this application. I do think also I do get what Councillor Smitherman is saying, and I think what Mr. Peck is saying, but we do have to keep pressing on sustainability. I accept that there are sometimes financial penalties, or there may be financial penalties, but there are even bigger penalties if we don't keep pressing forward on sustainability features in the developments that we agree. And if we're not agreeing them now, these are things that are going to be around in 2050 or beyond, when we should have had them in, and that we will be looked back on and say, well, why didn't they put those things into the things that were being approved in 2020? I do understand the conditions now are difficult, but we do have to keep pressing forward on that.
Thank you, Councillor Dean. Do any other members want to speak on this? Right, you've got a proposition from myself to approve this recommendation, and it was seconded by Councillor Bob Smitherman. Was there, Gary, remind me, the evening's dragging on a bit now, was there an additional condition you put on here in discussion?
Just an addition to number 26, Chair, just to ensure the passive provision of the EV points. So not an additional condition, just an addition to an existing one.
Okay, so all right. So you've got the recommendation as it stands, proposed by myself and seconded by Councillor Smitherman, to approve with that addition to an existing one that Gary's just told you. Heather, will you go to the vote, please?
Thanks, Chair. Councillor Noel Atkins, for, against or abstain?
For.
Councillor Paul Baker, for, against or abstain?
For.
Councillor Jim Dean, for, against, abstain?
For.
Councillor Karen Harman, for, against or abstain?
For.
Councillor Paul High, for, against, abstain?
For.
Councillor Helen Silman, for, against or abstain?
For.
Councillor Bob Smitherman, for, against or abstain?
For.
And Councillor Steve Wills, for, against or abstain? Councillor Steve Wills, still with us? Thank you. That's unanimous, Chair.
Right, that's passed unanimously. We'll move on to agenda item 6, public question time. excuse me, we did put out with the minutes that should any members of the public want to ask a public question, it should be submitted by midday on Monday, the 20th of April, 2020. I don't believe, Heather, we had any submitted, did we? Heather?
No.
No. So, Louise, help me now. What do we do on public question time where there's members of the public? Hopefully there's one or two left if they're not all been bored with us so far. How do we take the public question time, Louise?
So all the public questions now have to be submitted in writing. Heather's confirmed that there are no public questions, so that's the end of the public questions.
Okay, thank you very much. So with that, at 21:27, I close the meeting, and thank you, members and officers, for sticking with it. I personally think it went very well as to be expected, and we got through 4